Limbus Company is a gacha game with gameplay centered around team building. As new identities are released, they get sent off into compositions that synergize with them, and once enough identities that work towards a similar goal accumulate, you get an archetype. There are many valid team compositions with unique win conditions, but usually players gravitate to the idea of looking at the game through the lens of the 7 main status teams. See, I disagree with the notion that this is a good framework, as in the current state of Limbus, many of these keywords have subtypes fitted for certain encounter types and lengths, which may utilize different secondary win conditions. Hybrids exist as well, combining aspects of 2 teams at once, and stuff like the popular middle-focused Envy Resonance team isn't represented at all. But most importantly for this video, Charge and Poise are not teams. Now, before we get into the entire idea behind that statement, allow me to put up a disclaimer. This video is not a personal attack on those who like using Charge and Poise units. The point of this video isn't to make you hate those keywords, but instead, I just want to engage with Limbus Company design space in an interesting way. While we're at it, also allow me to remind you that most of my viewers are not subscribed, so if you find yourself coming back to my videos or end up enjoying this one, consider subscribing. It takes just 1 second and helps me out a lot. Now let's get to the fake teams. First, we need to understand what a team even is. On the surface, it's just a combination of any 7 identities, but in reality, you need 7 units and a shared goal. See, every team in the game has access to physical damage as a win condition. All skills do damage, and eventually, you can bring the enemy's HP down to 0 even if your identities have no synergy. This is the basic, primary win condition, and different teams fulfill this win con with differing efficiency. A team like Tremor can opt out of using the strongest damage dealers in the game, while Burn is an archetype that has always needed to rely on physical damage more than most. Why is that? Well, the difference maker is the secondary win condition, aka the shared goal of the identities in these teams. Tremor identities want to stack up Tremor, convert it into a stronger form, and burst it. This allows them to deal a lot of damage to the enemy in a short amount of time, bypassing physical resistances and effects like protection. This is why the team can get away with a below average physical damage profile, as the difference is made up by the staggering amount of effect damage when used on enemies weak to its affinities. Burn, on the other hand, does not have as strong of an effect, and is forced to do more physical damage to keep up. Of course, right now, the damage that these IDs do is literally the highest in the game, but this has historically always been true from a design perspective. Also, Burn can diversify its secondary win condition with supporting effects like Scorch or Dark Flame, allowing for some more bonus damage. Sure, the largest part of this team's damage breakdown is comprised of physical numbers, but if you were to replace one of the identities that help stacking with a unit that could do more damage, you would ruin the secondary win condition and end up losing damage overall. So stacking ends up being the incentive to run multiple identities with the same keyword. This applies to every one of these teams. And while their ratios of physical and status damage are unique, the central concept of status damage as at least a partial win condition and an incentive for status purity remains present. Another way for a team to achieve unity is through a shared mechanic that elevates its physical damage. This mostly applies to Envy Resonance, as that archetype consists of the middle identities, who want to stick together even though they really don't rely on the bleed and burn they inflict for damage. Their kits have the mechanic of converting their counters into their skill trees, allowing you to deal more damage when you run a cohesive version of this team. Thanks to this mechanic, you get value from running identities like Middle Dawn, and you want to run Middle Dawn instead of swapping to an ID like Rian Sang, even though the team is primarily physical. The shared middle gimmick is the incentive to run identities of the same faction here, much like the stacking of an effect is the incentive to run identities of the same keyword. Tying this back to Charge and Poise, we can see that both teams really struggle with this shared goal, as the two keywords are entirely self-contained within the identities that use them, instead of being inflicted on the enemy. Additionally, there are no stackable supporting effects that could be inflicted on the enemy, so the route to unity through stacking is cut off for both compositions. But surely, there is a reason to run multiple units with one of those keywords together, right? Well, let's look at them up close. Starting with Charge, we do see a couple of supporting effects. Charge Barrier, Photoelectricity and Spark Discharge all provide extra charge count to help the identities of this keyword with the resource economy. Additionally, Load, Magical Girl's Chant and Charge Sting are all effects that provide bonus damage specifically to charge skills. This is a healthy variety of secondary effects, but they don't exactly add up to be a win condition. The resource-based effects can help accelerate charge gain for some identities, but many simply don't need it. And the damage-based effects would have made a more compelling argument if they weren't so numerically disadvantaged. Load goes up to 15% and 30% on Warp Corp identities, but all the Warp Corp identities are simply too weak for modern standards, and 0 times 1.3 is still 0. Not to mention, you barely get access to it, and when you do, you need to max it out to get full value. Charge Sting is weakened for no real reason, as it provides diminishing buffs with every skill that utilizes it, and it's only available once every 6 turns. And Magical Girl's Chant is tied to a pretty expensive ego and an identity with a form that makes ego usage very dangerous. With these effects in play, it's clear that Charge has some synergy between its identities, or at least can have it, but the bond is simply not strong enough for you to not replace the weaker members, which is like 6 out of 7 identities, for units that do more damage. At the end of the day, the only win condition Charge has access to is physical damage, which makes it easy to replace Charge identities for newer ones, as the physical side of the game gets very actively power-crept, making it difficult for charge-focused units to stay relevant for long, much less be potent enough to be used as an entire team together for anything more tangible than flavor or fun. As for Poise, it's even more bleak. In terms of inflicted effects, the entire archetype hits you with the Mbappe special. And while basically every Poise identity under the sun has a unique buff, all of those affect just the unit in question, with one outlier being Mentor Merceau with his signature ego, who brings the blade lineage to the level of modern Poise identities. The main source of interactions between sinners here will mostly be Thoracalgia. These two egos provide Poise potency and count to your allies, allowing them to stack Poise better. Now, you'd think that Poise identities can stack Poise well on their own, but you'd be mistaken, so this comes into play pretty often. But realistically, if an identity can do more damage without critting, it fulfills the win condition of Poise better than its Poise contenders. So again, there's no real reason to run 7 Poise identities on field without a different connecting thread. At this point, you should be able to see that Charge and Poise lack the glue that holds the other teams together from a design perspective. And ironically, these teams struggle to answer the question of why wouldn't I run Rian Yisang here? I mean, I guess Rian is Poise, so that's only an issue for Charge, but on Poise you've got Knight of Despair Rodion dealing more damage than Sibranch, which would make her a better ID for the Poise win condition, despite not critting. This is the issue at hand, and I personally don't really like that these teams are in such a state, which means it's time for me to propose my changes, and we'll start with Charge, as that team has flavor that I like more than that of Poise, and, as I said, it's closer to being a team composition already as well. The Charge solution, in my eyes, lies in creating a shared resource that represents Charge. Think of Bloodfist, a blue Bloodfist for Charge. Let's call it charge battery. The battery's value is increased whenever an ally gets charge count. Whether it gets decreased or not when that ally loses charge or not depends on what we do with the effect. But in my solution I'll just say it can only increase from charge gain and does not decrease from charge consumption. So what does battery do? Well, we can take it in a few directions. The simplest and most uninspired way to go about it is to make charge identities do more damage based on the stack, gaining a 10% damage boost for every 100 stacks, with the effect going up to 999 for example. You could also throw in some offense levels there, in order to boost the static modifier side of the damage of charge identities, as well as their clashing. And voila! A very simple yet realistic solution. Having more charge identities with this effect present would lead to all charge identities dealing more damage. This means that replacing one ID for a non-charge damage dealer leads to all other units losing tempo, which would hurt your team. This creates an incentive to run 7 charge identities and acts like glue, which is precisely what we wanted. The reason why I called this solution realistic is because it basically already exists within the mirror dungeons. The T5 Perpetual Motion Machine Eagle gift gives all allies the self-resonant circuitry effect, which makes all charge allies deal more damage based on total charge count owned, and increases offense levels based on cumulative charge count consumed. It works off of a basic effect and not a generalized resource like Bloodfist, but that's just a difference in presentation. In fact, this very effect could be put on a passive of a newer charge identity and spread out to allies, and it would already make charge much realer as a composition. Project Moon would literally just need to copy the code, and there we go. That being said, this effect is kinda uninspired. Just more damage for the damage team? Lame. How about we use the effect in an interesting way? This is where my personal favorite idea comes in: Arcane Lightning. Instead of making battery give allies a passive effect, we can use it as a shared resource. By allowing a new identity to trigger an additional effect, you can consume battery stacks for something to happen. Arcane Lightning is that something. I see this effect as a kind of Tremor Burst-esque mechanic, where certain coins get to trigger it, and consume a set value of battery to output that number as either true or envy damage on the target. You could make the value static, or you could make it scale over the course of a fight. But then, here comes the gimmick. You see, Charge and Poise already have an intrinsic design advantage over inflictable effects in AoE fights, as identities that need to stack stuff on enemies can't do that when you're facing 7 guys. And the self-buffs can, as they don't really care about what happens on the enemy side of the field. We can lean into that by allowing the lightning to arc to a number of bonus allies equal to charge potency on the one who procs the effect. That way, we can make charge the archetype with access to effective multi-target status damage, which would give it unique flavor without overhauling its best use cases. And if you want to make it actually competitive, you could add a clause where if there's only one enemy, the lightning gets to jump back onto the same target to deal more damage, which would effectively turn lightning into a kind of charged dark flame, where it's a strong hit of status damage which gets stronger over the course of a fight, but it doesn't get reset after a certain number, so it plays into the whole scaling damage theme of charge. You could take either one of these ideas, or you could combine them, but I personally want to see what you guys can come up with, so make sure to leave a comment. Moving on to Poise, we could technically do the same thing with the shared effect, but I feel like Poise has worse flavor for that, as like, what would the effect even be? Collective breathing? That doesn't really make sense. Instead, I think we should address a pretty prominent issue with Poise as an effect. The potency stops mattering after 20, but it still stacks up to 99. If we want to utilize empty design space on Poise, the potency is a great thing to focus on. Just making overcapped Poise get value won't make it a team though, as it's still achievable without synergy. We want some central mechanic that interacts with Poise potency. And honestly, this issue is tougher to deal with, so I'm really interested in your guys' input. My idea right now is an inflictable effect that a new identity would have access to. The name for it? I don't know. Stands broken? We'll go with that for now. Stacking up that effect on an enemy makes them take more damage from critical hits specifically, and the value increases by a fraction of the Poise potency above 20 of the ally that hit the enemy. This way, every Poise identity still sets up on their own from 0 to 20 Poise, but once you get to the 100% crit threshold, your team can collectively work towards a greater damage increase, and you're incentivized to keep the team full of Poise identities to increase setup speed and to have everyone use the effect. Then, once the enemy dies, you will set up the effect faster on the next target, as you still continue stacking potency, so you get rewarded for greater Poise gain, and that can add an incentive to use Poise egos even if you can keep up the stack on all of your sinners consistently. This is pretty straightforward and generic, so we can try cooking something more unique. I'm not as sure in this idea for Poise as I am in my Arcane Lightning idea for Charge, so again, I'm super excited for your comments. My take, however, is that the whole critical strike flavor has always made me think of punching through resistances. Imagine hitting an enemy in heavy armor through a small opening. That's a critical strike. In Limbus though, crits just do a bit more damage. And while it's true that the modifier from Poise is static, so it stacks additively with resistances, and it is effectively punching through 0.2 resists on the enemy, I think we can lean into that idea harder while gluing together the team. Instead of making Stands Broken count up from 0, we can give it a base stack, let's say 250. Every time the enemy with the effect is hit, the stack is reduced by an amount equal to Poise above 20 on the sinner that hit it. Once it reaches 0, the effect bursts for a certain amount of true damage, resets back to 250, and we go again. As the fight progresses, your potency increases, and the true damage gets triggered more and more often, ramping up your output. This would, again, be great for encounters with multiple boss waves, as your identities retain Poise potency in between those, but the effect being tied to an inflictable debuff means that the true AoE niche ends up being left to Charge, while Poise becomes a ramp-up true damage composition, as opposed to the instant burst true damage compositions of Bleed and Rupture, that will struggle with using their status win conditions on back-to-back fights. Overall, these are my ideas for Charge and Poise to become actual compositions. The teams desperately need win conditions, and once they obtain those, we can finally call them real archetypes and not just for fun teams. But I'm curious what you think. How would you solve this issue? Or do you think Charge and Poise deserve to be secondary effects in the kits of identities that interact with other stuff? Let me know in the comments down below, and I will definitely read and respond. If you liked this video at any point, leave a like to let me know, and if you want to see more like this, consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye!